Just 2 weeks after our wedding, my wife went back to her ex. Now she's begging for another chance. But what I told her at the airport left her speechless and in tears. I never imagined my life would unravel so spectacularly, just 2 weeks into what was supposed to be forever. I'm a 30-year-old structural engineer, married to Emma, or rather, recently married. She's, or was, a 28-year-old wildlife veterinarian. And 2 weeks after we exchanged vows, with unopened wedding gifts still stacked in the corner of our living room, she chose to detonate everything we'd built. I stood in disbelief as the foundation of our lives collapsed, one that I had painstakingly and lovingly constructed, just like the buildings I spent my career designing. As a structural engineer, I've spent the last 8 years focusing on large-scale projects, skyscrapers, stadiums, commercial hubs. It's demanding work, with unpredictable hours and tight deadlines. Still, I've always loved it. Something is rewarding about watching a structure rise from mere lines on a blueprint into a living, breathing part of a city's skyline. I thought Emma understood that. She seemed to. Our story began most unexpectedly. At one of my sites, a hawk flew straight into the scaffolding. My site manager called the local wildlife center, and that's how Emma walked into my life. She arrived in muddy boots and wind-tousled hair, sticking out among the clean-cut construction crew like a wildflower in concrete. But she moved with quiet command, calming the panicked bird with practiced ease. I watched her cradle the hawk like it was spun from glass. Her compassion, her confidence. It hit me like a falling beam. We struck up a conversation while she examined the bird. She had just relocated to the city, unsure about the area. On impulse, I offered to show her around. To my surprise, she agreed. That led to a casual dinner, then a second, and slowly, a 3-year relationship unfolded. We laughed, argued, shared meals, rescued stray animals, and talked about dreams. Sure, there were disagreements about laundry, or me missing dinner because of late-night inspections, but we worked through it. She supported my brutal work hours. I respected her obsession with rescuing any animal within a 50-mile radius. Our place often resembled a small wildlife clinic. I still remember the week we housed a 3-legged raccoon in our guest bathroom. It was chaos, but a lovable shared chaos. We had plans. Kids someday. A house with a backyard and a couple of dogs. We even had silly quirks in common, like a mutual hatred for cilantro and a passion for binge-watching true crime documentaries. Our wedding was her dream realized. A sun-drenched vineyard, strung with fairy lights and decorated with blush-toned roses. It cost a fortune. I spent a year working extra hours, taking on every contract I could just to afford it. But her beaming face made every sleepless night worth it. Even her father, a stern ex-military man covered in tattoos, shed tears as he walked her down the aisle. I'd never seen that man cry, not even once. All my college friends came, even Kyle, my best friend, who was flying back and forth from Dubai for his project. He pulled me aside at the reception, concern etched on his face. Said he'd noticed things about Emma. Little inconsistencies, warning signs I refused to acknowledge. But I brushed him off. Love makes fools of us all. I was too caught up in the fantasy. The ceremony went flawlessly. Emma spent months curating every detail. The flowers were ordered from a boutique florist. The wine came from a vineyard we'd visited during a trip to Napa. She even hired a calligrapher to handwrite each guest's name on their place card. My mom whispered it was the most elegant wedding she'd ever seen. I beamed with pride, not knowing that behind the perfection lay secrets waiting to shatter us. The reception was unforgettable. We had a live band that kept the dance floor packed all night. Emma's Australian cousins taught us ridiculous drinking games that left half our wedding party groaning the next morning. During our first dance, I remember staring into Emma's eyes and feeling like I had just stepped into the life I had always dreamed of. We spent our honeymoon in Bali. It was paradise. I'd saved diligently, taking on weekend site visits and sacrificing vacations for a year just to make it happen. Emma had always wanted to visit Bali, to see the monkeys, the rice fields, the temples, and we did it all. We returned home tan, exhausted, and in love. Or so I thought. For exactly 14 days, life was blissful. We were newlyweds, giddy and in love. We called each other husband and wife with stupid grins. We still wore our rings like sacred relics. Emma talked excitedly about starting a family, maybe even trying for a baby the next year. I believed her. Then came the shift. It began subtly. Emma, once annoyed by my work emails at dinner, now seemed glued to her phone. She'd glance at it constantly, thumbing out rapid messages. When I'd walk into the room, she'd flip her screen down or swipe away the window like a guilty teenager. Naively, I told myself she was planning something special, Maybe a surprise for our 1-month anniversary. I was blind. She started staying late at the wildlife center. Sure, she had always done that occasionally, especially with injured or endangered animals requiring around-the-clock monitoring. But the frequency increased, and the explanations began to wobble. "There's an owl with a broken wing," she'd say. Or, "We got a red-tailed hawk that might not make it," but sometimes she'd forget what animal she claimed needed her care the night before. Once, she'd told me she'd been monitoring a sick fox, only to later mention something about spending the evening with an injured deer. I wanted to believe her, I really did. But even for someone who rehabilitated wildlife, her overnight shifts began to defy reason. The distance between us grew. Conversations became short and hollow. The warmth in her eyes started to vanish. She didn't kiss me goodbye in the mornings like she used to. Her laughter, so frequent before, now felt forced and rare. And still, I denied it, because denial is easier than confronting a reality that breaks your soul. One evening, Emma told me she had to stay late at the wildlife center to monitor an injured fox. That didn't raise any red flags. Until I happened to scroll through the center's Instagram account and saw a cheerful post earlier that morning announcing the fox's release. There was even a video of it hobbling into the woods, tail wagging like it had somewhere to be. I wanted to confront her, to demand the truth, but instead, I swallowed the suspicion like poison. I wasn't ready to face what my gut was already screaming. At the time, I was completely buried in work, leading the design of a 50-story hospital expansion downtown. The most ironic part, the project was for Ryan's hospital, Emma's ex. The trauma center was getting a massive overhaul, and our firm had landed the contract, and that, I suspect, was how Olivia found out Ryan was back in town. Now, Olivia, where do I even start? 32, receptionist at the wildlife center, twice divorced before 30, and notorious for cycling through boyfriends faster than seasons change. Her Instagram bio literally read, "If you can't handle me at my worst, you don't deserve me at my best." That alone should have told me everything I needed to know. She and Emma had gotten close at work, and suddenly she was at our place nearly every weekend. I never liked her. There was something performative about her. Everything had to be dramatic or extreme. Still, I kept my mouth shut, trying not to rock the boat. What I didn't know then was that Olivia had once asked James, one of the wildlife volunteers, about me. Apparently, back when I first showed up with the injured hawk, she'd tried to get my number. I was already into Emma and barely noticed. But Olivia didn't forget. Looking back, it makes too much sense. She didn't just dislike me, she resented me. I started hearing hushed conversations between them. Whispered giggles in the kitchen always fell silent when I entered the room. One time, I overheard Olivia say something like, "You deserve to be happy. You can't help how you feel." I brushed it off. Now I realize she was fueling the fire every chance she got. Then came the day it all crashed down. I'd been up since 5, buried in structural schematics, caffeine barely holding me together. Emma shuffled into my home office around 11, eyes red, hair unbrushed, still in pajamas. She sat down on the couch and started crying. Not the quiet kind, but those wrenching sobs that twist your stomach. My first thought was that someone had died. Through broken sentences and tears, the truth spilled out. Olivia had encouraged her to reach out to Ryan. Turns out they'd been texting for weeks. He was back, working at the hospital. Our project site. Ryan wasn't some casual ex, he was her college sweetheart. 4 years together before he jetted off to Africa with Doctors Without Borders, and now he was back, a charming trauma surgeon, conveniently reappearing just as we began our married life. Ryan told Emma he regretted leaving, that he still loved her, and instead of shutting that door, she let it swing wide open. She sat there, sniffling, saying she was confused, that Olivia had helped her realize she had unresolved feelings. She said, "I owe it to myself to find out if those feelings are still real before I commit to our marriage." I blinked. Commit to our marriage? We were already married. The ink on our marriage license was barely dry. The thank you notes from the wedding hadn't even been written, and here she was, talking like our vows were some soft draft for her to edit later. Then she said the thing I'll never forget. "I don't want us to end up divorced with kids in 5 years because I never figured this out." She framed it like she was doing me a favor, like I should thank her for her emotional honesty while she trampled our relationship underfoot. But instead of begging her to stay or breaking down in some grand romantic scene, I laugh. Not the amused kind, but a hollow, bitter sound. The kind that escapes when the pain is so sharp it almost feels surreal. She looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I opened my laptop, searched for best divorce lawyers near me, started dialing. She panicked. "What are you doing?" I stared her down and said, "No, what you need is to get out of my house." She started crying again, harder this time, said I was being unfair. I didn't understand how complicated her feelings were. And then, she actually said this: "Ryan was my first love. I need to know if there's still something there. I'll always wonder what if I don't explore it." That was my breaking point. I stood up, cold and steady. "You know what's not complicated?" I said. "Wedding vows. You either meant them or you didn't, and clearly, you didn't." Then, just when I thought we'd reached the bottom, she spun everything around and accused me of being controlling and unsupportive. She said I wasn't letting her figure out her feelings, that I was smothering her at a time she needed space. Apparently, Olivia had told her that any man who truly loved her would be patient, that real love meant stepping aside and allowing her the freedom to explore unresolved emotions. That wasn't support. That was blind stupidity, and I wasn't about to sign up for it. Fed up, I pulled out my phone, scrolled past hundreds of sunny honeymoon photos filled with fake smiles and forced intimacy, until I found what I was looking for: our wedding video. I made her sit down and watch the part where she looked into my eyes and promised to forsake all others, to be faithful, to stand beside me through everything. I paused the video and asked her, coldly, "Were you lying then, or are you lying now?" She didn't say a word, just sat there, quiet and still, like the weight of her own betrayal had finally caught up to her. She tried shifting gears after that, suggesting maybe we could try couples counseling, that maybe therapy could help us work through the mess. I stared at her and said flatly, "The only thing I need to work through right now is finding a damn good lawyer." Then came the final blow. With a straight face, she told me, "Ryan just finished a 36-hour shift at the hospital. He said I can stay with him while I sort things out." I just stared at her, stunned. She already had bags packed in her car. Turns out she'd been moving things to his place in secret while I was burning the candle at both ends for our future. She was planning her exit with the very man who'd once broken her heart. It was betrayal wrapped in cowardice. I wish I could say I kept my cool, but I didn't. I went through our wedding gifts, most still unopened, and started making two piles on the living room floor, one labeled "She's Not Getting" and the other "She Can Have." Really mature, I know. I didn't care. I was spiraling. I called Kyle, my best friend stationed in Dubai, and when he heard the situation, he didn't even hesitate. He booked the first flight home and was on his way before I had even finished ranting. A real friend. Emma, of course, tried to say I was being dramatic, that I was involving other people in our marriage. I reminded her she was the one who dragged her ex and toxic best friend into the middle of it first, so maybe she wasn't in a position to lecture me about boundaries. The hours after that conversation were a haze. Emma would cycle through crying hysterically, trying to justify herself, then accusing me of not being empathetic enough. She kept saying things like, "I still love you, and just because I need to do this doesn't mean I don't care about you." My personal favorite, "You'll always be special to me," as if she were ending a summer fling and not tearing down a 2-week-old marriage. Finally, I had to draw the line. I told her, straight-faced, that she had two choices: cut off all contact with Ryan immediately, and we could maybe, just maybe, try to fix this, or leave now, and it was over. Permanently. No second chances. She blinked at me like I'd grown a second head. "Why does it have to be so black and white?" she asked. And that was when I knew, completely, deeply, that we were done. She didn't even understand the basic principle of commitment. I told her to leave and not come back. She tried to hug me on her way out. The audacity. I turned away and walked out of the room. I couldn't bear to let her touch me again. The sound of her car pulling out of our driveway is still imprinted in my memory. She drove away from the home we were supposed to build our future in, probably heading straight to Ryan's apartment, while our wedding cards, filled with well wishes and prayers for lifelong happiness, still sat unopened on the kitchen counter. That night, Kyle and I got absolutely blackout drunk on the back patio. He had landed that evening and without saying a word poured me a double of Jack. I deleted every social media account I had. I couldn't stand to see her face. I couldn't deal with the questions or sympathy messages. The next morning, hungover and emotionally shattered, I was sitting on the couch beside Kyle trying to piece together what the hell came next, when someone started pounding on the front door. Not just knocking, slamming, like a cop serving a warrant. My first thought? Emma was back. Maybe for more of her stuff. But when I opened the door, it wasn't her. It was her father. "Let me tell you about Mike," 6'4", a wall of a man covered in intimidating military tattoos. An ex-Marine who now runs one of the top private security firms in the region. The man could probably snap me in half with one arm. I froze. I honestly thought he'd come to hit me. Instead, he just looked me in the eye and said, "My daughter's an idiot. Got any coffee?" Turns out, Emma had called her mom, crying, spinning the story into some tale about how I was being cold and unsupportive while she processed her emotions. Her mother, who always coddled her, bought every word. But not Mike. He wasn't having any of it. We sat at the kitchen table, me, Mike, and Kyle, nursing mugs of coffee spiked with Jack Daniels at 9 a.m. Mike lit into the situation, telling us he never trusted Ryan, even back in college. Said something about him always gave off a weird vibe. Then he dropped a bomb I hadn't seen coming. Apparently, Ryan had cheated on Emma in college, something she never found out about. One of her friends had told Mike back then, but he and her mom decided not to tell Emma because she was too fragile. And now, years later, here she was, running back to the same guy, completely in the dark about who he really was. You couldn't script this stuff. Mike, to his credit, didn't hold back. He even recommended a top-tier divorce lawyer, the same one he'd used in a corporate lawsuit. He also half-jokingly offered to send a few of his security guys to pay Ryan a visit. I declined, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and emotional cleanup. I had to call my boss and explain why I needed to take a step back from the skyscraper project. Surprisingly, he was more than understanding. Said I'd been working like a machine for too long, and told me to take whatever time I needed. Turns out my boss had been through something eerily similar. His first wife had pulled almost the same stunt years ago, so he understood where I was coming from more than I expected. Without hesitation, he gave me 2 full weeks of paid leave and assured me that the skyscraper project would still be waiting when I was ready to return. That was the one small relief in the avalanche of everything else going wrong. But what crushed me most wasn't the betrayal itself. It was dealing with all the remnants of our life together, scattered like landmines throughout the house. Our home looked like a wedding exploded in it. Boxes of unopened gifts lined the hallway, and envelopes stuffed with congratulatory cards sat untouched on the dining table. I found our marriage certificate buried in a pile of junk mail and completely lost it. I dropped to my knees right there on the kitchen floor and sobbed until I couldn't breathe. A few days into the fallout, Emma's younger brother James came by to collect some of her belongings. He worked at my firm as a junior engineer, which only made things more complicated. Poor guy looked like he wished the earth would swallow him whole. He'd always looked up to me like a big brother, and now he was stuck between loyalty to his sister and knowing what she'd done was beyond wrong. James told me Emma was still staying at Ryan's place, said she was acting like a completely different person, posting cryptic Instagram quotes about following your heart and finding your higher path. It was like she'd entered some midlife spiritual awakening curated entirely by Pinterest and Olivia's bad advice. The family dynamic was a war zone. Emma's mom, always eager to justify her daughter's actions, insisted I just needed to give her space. Marriage is about patience and understanding, she kept repeating like a mantra. Meanwhile, Mike, Emma's father, and James were firmly in my corner. Mike even had blowout arguments with Emma's mom over it. I heard through James that there were nights they didn't even speak. Then, as if things couldn't get more petty, Olivia started trash-talking me at the wildlife center. She told everyone I was emotionally unavailable and obsessed with work, and that's why Emma left. A few people I considered friends, mutual acquaintances from double dates or work functions, started unfollowing me on social media. It was like I'd been quietly exiled. But karma, as they say, doesn't miss. Remember that massive hospital expansion I was designing? Yeah, that hospital belonged to Ryan's employer. When I called my boss and explained the conflict of interest, he didn't hesitate. He reassigned the project to another manager. Ryan apparently threw a full-blown tantrum about the delays. The irony? His relationship with Emma was directly sabotaging a job that could have helped his own career. The financial aftermath was just as messy. We'd only recently merged our bank accounts after the wedding, so I had to freeze everything, unmerge our funds, and set up new accounts. It was a logistical nightmare. Thankfully, we hadn't bought a house yet. We'd been saving for a down payment and still lived in my old condo. That small detail spared me thousands in potential losses. The condo, in my name, remained my one real asset. She had no claim to it. Emma left me a few rambling voicemails during all this. She said she still cared about me and hoped we could be friends someday. Sure, right after I finished tossing our wedding photo album into the fireplace. Her father, Mike, kept me updated on what was happening behind the scenes. According to him, Emma and Ryan were living it up, posting stage date night pics, dining at fancy restaurants, pretending the past 2 weeks hadn't happened. But then came the worst blow of all. James, while helping Emma set up her new work-issued iPad, accidentally discovered something that shattered the last sliver of peace I'd managed to build. The tablet synced automatically with her old family cloud account, and what popped up? Dozens of messages from Ryan, some sent in the week leading up to our wedding. They'd been in contact for months before we got married. Let that sink in. The woman I stood beside at the altar had already opened the door to another man. My own brother-in-law had to be the one to break that news to me. That was when I decided. I had to let go. No more hoping, no more what-ifs. I buried myself in my work again, this time not out of duty, but for survival. And as fate would have it, all those late nights and long hours paid off. My revised foundation design for the skyscraper project ended up saving the client several $1,000,000. My boss was so impressed that he fast-tracked me for promotion. I went from shattered to senior project lead in a matter of weeks. Meanwhile, Emma's finding herself fantasy started showing cracks. James, who still worked with me, kept me updated. Living with Ryan, as it turned out, wasn't the dream she'd imagined. The guy was a textbook workaholic, barely home, and when he was, he treated the apartment like a frat house. Dirty scrubs on the floor, fast food containers everywhere, constant texts from other doctors. Emma was learning that maybe the grass on the other side wasn't green, it was just fake turf. Then Katie, a senior vet at the Wildlife Center and Emma's former mentor, reached out. She'd always respected how much overtime I worked to give Emma her dream wedding. She told me she was sickened by how Emma spun the narrative, calling me controlling and obsessed with work. Katie had quietly become my eyes and ears at the center. She sent me a screenshot one day, Emma crying in the break room because Ryan forgot their 1-month anniversary. I stared at that photo for a long time. You threw away a committed marriage for this guy? And now you're crying about him missing a glorified date night? Then James dropped another bomb. He'd seen Emma recently while picking something up from their parents' place, said she looked like a ghost of herself, decked out in designer labels, probably funded by Ryan, but her expression was hollow. She looked exhausted. When she saw him, she got emotional, asked how I was doing, told him she missed me, missed our old life. She even tried to hug him goodbye. A few days later, she showed up on my doorstep. I opened the door, surprised but calm. She looked up at me, eyes glassy with tears, and said, "I miss you. I miss you. Ryan's not who I thought he was." I couldn't help it. I laughed. It was almost laughable. Actually, no, it was hilarious. Emma stood there, tear-streaked and unraveling, begging me to listen. And what did I do? I told her I had a meeting to get to. Total lie. Then I turned around and walked away without so much as a second glance. The old me, the guy who'd bent over backward for her, who put everyone else's needs before his own, might have tried to comfort her, might have entertained some delusion of reconciliation, but the man standing there that day, he was someone new. I walked out, grabbed a protein shake from the fridge, headed straight to the gym, and shattered my personal record for deadlifts. The weight was nothing compared to the baggage I'd just dropped. Later that night, I got a call from a headhunter about a prestigious new position. A global architecture and engineering firm in Singapore was launching an ambitious eco-friendly skyscraper development. They had heard about my innovative foundation design, yes, the one that saved our last client millions, and wanted me to lead the project. 2-year contract, 7-figure salary, full relocation package, not just a job, an opportunity to rebuild my life, far away from all this chaos. I didn't hesitate. When word got out, because it always does, Emma showed up at my office. She barged in without an appointment, sobbing uncontrollably. She pleaded with me not to leave, said she was confused about her feelings, that she'd made a mistake. I didn't even look up from the blueprint I was sketching. I calmly said, "That sounds like a you problem," and continued my work. The expression on her face was worth more than any apology she could ever give. Frozen, mouth slightly open as if she couldn't believe I no longer cared. But I didn't. Not anymore. Apparently, one of Ryan's co-workers saw Emma crying in my office and couldn't keep his mouth shut. He told Ryan about it, and Ryan, true to form, lost his mind. Started blowing up Emma's phone, demanding answers, acting like a jealous teenager. Hilarious, considering this was the same guy who had no issue texting my wife behind my back just days before our wedding. But sure, get mad now, champ. And it gets better. While Ryan was busy throwing a tantrum over Emma's emotional relapse, guess who was flooding his phone with messages? Yup, Olivia. Turns out she and Ryan had been doing lunch fairly often, and by lunch I mean locking his office door during breaks while Emma was working. I found out thanks to Steve, the project manager, who took over the hospital contract after I stepped back. Being the solid guy he is, Steve kept me in the loop. He even sent me discreet photos of Ryan and Olivia looking far too cozy for two professional colleagues during site walkthroughs. The same woman who helped destroy my marriage was making her move on the man she practically shoved Emma into the arms of. You literally can't script this level of irony. Emma discovered the betrayal during a birthday dinner she'd planned for Ryan. She had gone all out, spent a week prepping his favorite meal, ordered a custom cake, and even gifted him a luxury watch. Funny, she never cooked for me once in our entire relationship. Anyway, while they were eating, Ryan received a drunk text from Olivia that said, "I miss our lunches. Hope Emma doesn't check your second phone." Yup, second phone. Ryan had a whole hidden device just for talking to Olivia, like some sleazy high schooler juggling side chicks. When Emma read the message, she lost it, threw his watch across the apartment, screamed at him in front of neighbors, and stormed out into the night. She tried calling her mom, but she was on a cruise. She tried calling Mike, her dad, and he responded with, "You made your bed, lie in it." Then she tried James, her little brother, who now worked on my team and had just been promoted thanks to me. He was working late and ignored the call. You know who she called last? At midnight, crying, telling me how Ryan was just like all the others, how she made the biggest mistake of her life, how she should have never left. I didn't answer, sent the voicemail straight to my lawyer. The following morning was absolute chaos at the wildlife center. Emma walked into work to find Olivia acting like nothing had happened. They had a nuclear-grade screaming match in the break room. Katie, my loyal informant and senior vet, recorded the whole thing. She sent me the video instantly. Evidence, just in case I needed more ammo for the divorce proceedings. But the cherry on top? In the middle of their argument, Ryan shows up, trying to defuse the situation. Says he and Olivia were just friends, and that Emma was overreacting. Olivia, queen of the backstabbers, turned to Emma, looked her straight in the eye and said, "At least I waited until he was single, unlike some people." Security had to get involved. Emma and Olivia were both written up. Ryan was escorted off the property. A masterpiece of karmic retribution. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my office, signing the final contracts for Singapore, prepping for my new life on a different continent. The company was even flying Kyle in, my best friend, who'd dropped everything for me during the darkest days. They offered him a senior engineering role. Deserved, honestly. The man is brilliant when he's not dragging me away from whiskey-fueled self-destruction. Emma wasn't done, though. She sent me an essay-length email pouring her heart out, said she finally saw things clearly, realized what she had thrown away. Admittedly, Ryan was a fantasy, and I was the real deal. She claimed leaving me was the biggest mistake of her life. I replied with one sentence. "Cool story. Please direct all future communication to my lawyer." Predictably, she then tried using her family as a last-ditch effort. Her mom, fresh off the cruise, showed up at my place unannounced, went on a dramatic monologue about young love, second chances, and how everyone deserves forgiveness. Mike found out and was livid. Drove over, pulled her mom away, and before leaving, told me he was still coming to Singapore to visit once I got settled. That man's a legend. From James, I learned that Emma had moved back in with her parents. Ryan had already started seeing someone new, a nurse in pediatrics apparently. Olivia, unsurprisingly, got fired from the wildlife center. Turns out creating a hostile work environment isn't a great look when your job revolves around compassion and animal welfare. Who knew? As for me, my firm threw an epic farewell party. They rented out a swanky rooftop bar downtown. Everyone from the company came, including clients and partners. And the best part? James, Smith's brother, was one of the main planners. Funny how life works out sometimes. He hadn't told many people about the farewell party. Not his extended family, not even some of his co-workers. Mostly to avoid unnecessary drama. But somehow, despite his careful silence, Emma found out anyway. I'd bet good money Olivia was behind it. She still had ties to people at our firm, particularly one of the receptionists, who always seemed a little too interested in the office gossip. The party itself was off to an amazing start. Everyone from the firm came out. A few college friends even flew in to celebrate. My Singapore work visa had been approved earlier that day, my new condo overseas was ready, and I was in the best shape of my life. Thank you post-breakup gym obsession. For the first time in months, I felt like the storm had finally passed. Then came the chaos. Around 10 p.m., right as people were clinking glasses and giving farewell toasts, she arrived. And she didn't just show up, she made a scene. She wore the dress, the one she wore on our very first date. The same dress I'd once told her was the moment I fell in love with her. Apparently, she'd kept it all these years and decided that this was the perfect time to resurrect it. Clearly, she was aiming for a dramatic, rom-com style moment. Maybe she thought the universe would cue the soft piano music as I turned around, saw her standing there in that dress, and realized I still loved her. But real life doesn't work that way. Security stopped her at the entrance because, surprise, she wasn't on the guest list. I didn't even notice right away. I was talking with a visiting architect from the Singapore firm. Cool woman, sharp mind, and probably the first person I'd met in months who didn't know or care about my ex. Then James came flying up the stairs like a man on a mission. Dude, Emma's here. She's crying and she's making a scene. I rushed to the lobby and there she was, tears streaming, arguing with the security guard like she was trying to get into a private concert. The mascara streaks, the disheveled dress, it was all a mess. She spotted me and immediately launched into this emotional rant about how she'd made a huge mistake. Ryan meant nothing. She wanted to come with me to Singapore and start over. Mind you, this was happening in full view of at least 20 coworkers. Emma was slurring slightly. Clearly, she'd had something to drink. And that iconic dress? It didn't even fit right anymore. She'd lost weight from the stress, and now it looked like she was trying to squeeze into a memory that didn't belong to her anymore. Then came the kicker. She told me she'd bought a plane ticket to Singapore. A real one. Leaving the following week. Her plan? To show up at my new place and win me back. She thought it would be romantic. I thought it sounded dangerously close to stalking. I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You need help, real, professional help." And with that, I walked back into the party. Emma tried to follow me in. Security blocked her. She started shouting about how I never really loved her, because if I did, I'd forgive just one mistake. That's when Kyle stepped in, calm but sharp as a blade. "A mistake?" he said. "You mean texting your ex behind his back before the wedding? Or moving in with that same guy 2 weeks after the honeymoon? Which one of those was the single mistake?" She went silent, then broke down even harder. And as if this weren't enough of a cosmic comedy, right at that moment, Ryan walked by the building with his new girlfriend, the pediatric nurse. He saw Emma, mid-meltdown, her dress clinging awkwardly, sobbing in the arms of a bouncer. He did a double take, looked mortified, and then just kept walking. Didn't even acknowledge her. The look on her face, priceless, crushed, like her last thread of hope had snapped. Security finally managed to get her to leave, but not before she tried to hand me a letter. I didn't take it. She dropped it on the floor. Kyle picked it up and we read it, later that night. After a few drinks, of course. It was a masterpiece of delusion. Page after page of her rewriting our relationship history to cast herself as the misunderstood victim, and me as the distant, career-obsessed villain. A real work of fiction. But honestly, the party only got better after she left. People were buying me drinks, patting me on the back, telling me I'd dodged a cannonball. Even the architect from Singapore, Sarah, by the way, because irony is poetic, gave me her number and said she'd love to show me around when I landed. Emma, on the other hand, she apparently went to Ryan's place after leaving the party. And who answered the door? Nurse girl. According to James, the confrontation didn't go well. Screaming, crying, awkward neighbors peeking through their blinds. The full spectacle. Ryan didn't even let her inside. Last I heard, she's in therapy now. Good. Genuinely. But it's too late. A few days later, I was preparing to leave for Singapore. Everything was packed. I said goodbye to my parents, handed the condo keys to my new tenants, and felt ready to start fresh. And then, Emma pulled one last stunt. My flight was at 6 a.m., with a connection in Dubai where Kyle lives. My parents and James were driving me to the airport. Everything was running smoothly. Until I got to the check-in counter. There she was, Emma, luggage beside her, ticket in hand. She'd bought a seat on the same flight. Not to Singapore, she couldn't afford that, but to Dubai. She figured she'd convince me mid-flight, or follow me to Singapore somehow. She hadn't really thought it through. And to top it off, she brought her dad. She thought he'd help her convince me. But Mike, legend that he is, he had found out about her insane plan through James. He showed up at the airport not to support her, but to stop her. When I saw them, Emma jumped into a dramatic speech about how love is worth fighting for. how she had to try one more time, how she wouldn't give up on us. And behind her, Mike stood there with a face that said, "I raised her better than this." Then she reached into her carry-on bag and pulled out a photo album. She held out the photo album like it was some kind of holy relic, something she had clearly poured hours, maybe days, into assembling. It was filled cover to cover with pictures from our time together, our first date, vacations, holidays, our wedding day, honeymoon photos, every smiling moment she could find to prove that what we had was real, and it had been real. But that didn't change what she'd done. She genuinely believed that flipping through old memories would undo the present, that I'd see us smiling at our wedding and forget the betrayal, the lies, the night she spent texting another man while I was designing our future. I didn't even glance at the album. I just stepped around her and continued to check in my luggage. That was the end of the conversation for me. But Emma wasn't done. She started crying, loud enough to turn heads, and insisted that she'd prove her love by flying to Singapore, that she'd chase me across the world if she had to. It was desperate, theatrical, and deeply sad. That's when Mike, her dad, the only sane one in the whole mess, finally had enough. He grabbed her suitcase and said, firmly and without raising his voice, "The only place you're following anyone is back home. You're embarrassing yourself. And more importantly, you're embarrassing me." Emma went completely silent. For the first time in this entire ordeal, she had no words. It was like being scolded by the last person she thought would ever turn against her. And honestly, it should have been a wake-up call. While this whole scene was unfolding at the airport terminal, guess who else happened to be there? Sarah, the architect from Singapore. Turns out she was flying back on the same route after her visit for the project handover. She spotted me from across the terminal, smiled, and walked over, gave me a big hug and said, "You ready for our dinner plans this weekend?" The timing could not have been more perfect. Emma's face went completely blank. You could almost hear her brain trying to catch up with what was happening. Then she did this strange laugh-cry hybrid and muttered, "You're already dating? I thought what we had was special." That was it. I'd held back for months. I'd stayed civil, stayed distant, kept my dignity. But at that moment I finally let the truth out. "Yes, what we had was special," I told her. "And you traded it away for a fantasy with someone who already moved on. That's not on me. That's on you." Mike practically had to drag her out of the terminal. I didn't look back. The last thing I heard was her voice breaking, crying that I was being cruel for moving on. The irony of that hit so hard I nearly laughed again. Cruel? After everything? The flight, on the other hand, was nothing short of incredible. I got bumped to first class, had a few drinks with Sarah, and for the first time in what felt like forever, talked about architecture and life and possibilities, without any baggage. Turns out we had a lot in common. She's smart, ambitious, and best of all, emotionally stable. We've got dinner plans tomorrow night. I landed in Singapore a few hours ago. My new condo is unreal. Panoramic city view, sleek modern interior, and yes, a private pool. I just got a text from Mike of all people. Emma finally agreed to take therapy seriously. She moved back in with her parents, quit the wildlife center. Apparently there was too much residual drama there, especially with Olivia still creeping around. She's working on herself now. Good for her, genuinely. But it doesn't change anything. Ryan? According to James, he's engaged to that pediatric nurse already. It's been, what, 2 months? I'm sure that'll end well. And Olivia? Fired. She's now working at some shady private zoo where the monkeys probably have better people skills than she does. Karma has a way of finding the right targets, even if it takes a little time. Right now, I'm standing in my living room, gazing out at the Singapore skyline with a glass of wine in my hand. Tomorrow, I kick off the biggest project of my career. Next weekend, I have a date with an incredible woman, my best friend, and Emma's brother, who, at this point, is more like my real brother, will be flying in soon to join me. Life's funny like that. Sometimes the worst things that happen to you are just the setup for something better. Much better. To everyone who's followed this wild ride, thanks for sticking with me. Big shout out to those who told me to hit the gym, invest in myself, and not let someone else's poor choices define my worth. You were absolutely right. And Emma, if you're somehow reading this, I know you still check my Reddit posts even though this is a throwaway account. I truly hope you get the help you need. I mean that. But I won't be there to see it. This is the start of something new.